Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today's video is inspired by a couple of different things. The first one of those was recently on the channel. I did my 333rd episode of the Book Binge, and I got a comment on that video because it was kind of like a special video, a semi-special video in some sense, where I just talked about a few authors that I wanted to read, a few series specifically that I wanted to read, and a few individual standalone books that I was looking forward to reading. So just, a kind of halfway pile of shame video in some sense, but really mostly just talk about some things that I was looking forward to getting to in the relatively near future. And I got a comment on that video that was basically, talking about my well-rounded reading pursuits, basically. I'm pretty sure that was verbatim, that forward phrase was in the comment. And then I also featured on iSamwise's channel a little bit earlier this year. I want to say it was like back in March or something like that. I'll link to the video right up there, and that video was just us chatting about things, but very early on in the video we discussed a pretty similar topic. That was Sam asking me about my well-rounded reading, my purposes behind doing such a thing, and thus I kind of developed that idea to address the topic directly in its own video, having a diverse TBR, that being the topic. So I do recommend that you check out both of those other videos at some point, but for now I'll bring up the relevant points as necessary in this video. The first thing to discuss is basically that collab that I did with iSamwise. Basically right at the beginning of the collab, like I said, Sam spoke about this aspect of my TBR, i.e. the fact that I never really pigeonholed myself as a creator into a specific genre with my channel. So, implicitly via my reading, let alone my actual coverage of it. I think these two things are related, as they are going to be in my case, right? So specifically, I believe my answer to his question explained my reading journey a little bit and the way that informed my approach. So I'm going to insert a clip right here that basically talks about what kind of motivated that decision early on as far as the channel was concerned.
I appreciate your channel for a number of reasons. One of them is, and this is something that you were saying before we went live, is that you're not really pigeonholed to one genre or one thing. Tell me a little bit about what you read and cover on your channel.
I guess the main point is that I've never been super pigeonholed as far as what I like to read in the first place. I have a mild variety from my reading history in that way, but also the main problem that I discovered when I was into reading was I get burnt out. I get like world fatigue, for example, pretty easily. If I read too much of the same thing in too small a span of time, I just kind of stop reading it, not because I don't enjoy it or because I don't want to, but because I just stop. So a way to combat that when getting back into reading, if I read the one book a month but had another book in between now and again that was something completely different, that was variety enough for me to not get fatigued out of any of these worlds. And that was very important. When doing the booktube thing, I was like, well, I want to actually review all of the books that I read in some capacity, just because that seemed fun and interesting to me. And that's what I've continued doing. So the fact that I read variety is largely to avoid problems with fatigue or burnout or potential for that. And then the fact that I cover all of it was just a personal decision. And that means that I've not relegated myself to only fantasy or anything. So basically, the long story short of that clip, the TLDR of it, so to speak, is that I made a conscious personal decision back in 2021 when I came back to start reading again more fully, especially late 2021, to not read too much of the same thing constantly. And that was motivated by the world fatigue and that kind of problem that would end up arising. So basically my goal was to switch genre, to switch author, and to switch series relatively consistently. And even if I was switching series, it was more so to make sure that even if I was reading a series back-to-back or in back-to-back months or something like that, to make sure that there were other things breaking it up in between, whatever those other things ended up being. So even if some things featured pretty heavily in one month or another, for example, I can remember the middle of 2023 when I had like 3 epic fantasy books going on at the same time, those being The Great Hunt, book 2 of the Wheel of Time, Malice, the first book in Faithful and the Fallen, and also The Prophet of Adan, the second book in the Adan trilogy. That ended up, doing a lot, not of damage per se to my fantasy reading plans that year, but it ended up being a lot, and that in and of itself nearly burnt me out on fantasy alone. But because I had enough other stuff that I decided to go with for the next couple of months, it meant that my other reading plans and fantasy side of things went on as normal because I wasn't consistently doing that so much as to completely burn myself on it for a prolonged period of time, if any of that makes sense. So, between making that conscious decision, like I said, back in 2021, and additionally making sure to keep my active interests pretty broad and malleable, not pigeonholing what I am curious about reading into any one or two specific genres, that means that I just have a broader palette of stuff that I'm looking forward to reading. If you saw the thumbnail, I have the stack of books right over here still. All of these are books that I have read, and none of these are remotely close to each other. Okay, that's a lie. One of these books I have not read yet, but we'll talk about that in another video this month, ironically enough. But all the rest of them I have read, and all of them are very different from one another, and that has done me a heck of a lot of good on the channel. This overall decision carried into my channel identity, not just in my reading interests, but, in what this channel does. Like I said, it may not be great for growth. I believe I said it in that interview. Whether I included it in the edit of this video or not, I'm not 100% sure, because obviously I have to edit this after I'm recording it. But when it came to actually doing the channel, it's not great for growth reasons, right? To not have like a specific niche. My niche, quote unquote, is just the general broad desire to review all of the things I read. And because I read very diversely, that means that what I'm actually covering is pretty diverse. And I think that what that means is that when people are coming to my channel for any one thing or another, they may not necessarily stick around broad scale because I'm not covering the thing that they're interested in all of the time. But what it does mean is that the people who come to understand and trust my opinion on things for whatever reason, and I'm very blessed to be in a position that there are people who do care or trust about my opinions on anything, it means that they can, use that kind of opinion in other spheres that isn't just fantasy or just sci-fi or something like that. There is something to be said for being rather specialized in any one given thing. I've learned in my life I'm very good at being a jack of all trades and not very good at being a master of any, and that has kind of carried through into all things. I can't find myself being a master of any one given thing. I think I'm slightly too autistic for that. I have my special interests, but the special interests only last so long before I move on to the next one, right? So I end up being pretty decently informed on a lot of different things, but not necessarily the most informed on a specific one. Like I said, ironically, I think that personality side of myself has carried over into my reading, into other things that I do for entertainment, but therefore into what I do with YouTube, with this channel, and also with my second channel. And even though it's not necessarily great for, viral growth or anything crazy like that, it's just, a strength of me being able to do what I want and not really caring because I'm enjoying myself, if that makes any sense. So, that kind of brings us into what my next topic in my notes was going to be, how things are going 5 years later. Well, I think I've already, discussed a little bit of this to some degree, but really what it comes down to is that as time has gone on, I feel like I've become more justified in my general plans and ideals. Later in the same interview with Sam, and I'll try to see if I can find the clip of this and include it here as well, I also loosely talked about how I tend to organize my TBR. Nowadays, I think my schedule this year, I have tried the last couple years to have a rough schedule for the whole year, where the first quarter is more or less set in stone. The second quarter is a little bit looser. The third quarter is like, definitely things are probably not going to look this way by then. And then the last quarter is like, who knows if this is going to actually happen.
Sure.
So like varying degrees of how set it is, but I do plan things out a good bit ahead of time just so that I'm not floundering trying to figure out what I want to read. I don't like just kind of going solely off of mood. This year I'm getting back on like having things planned out and reading it with other people, kind of like what I was doing in 2022, to actually give a little bit more solidity, if that's a word,
Sure.
to my schedule. And I feel like that's actually helped a little bit this year in comparison to last. Whether I just included a clip there or not, I'm not 100% sure, but basically what I do with my TBR nowadays is currently based off of my consistent monthly read along stuff or comparable. And that was even more true back a handful of years ago before filling in the gaps of what I'm reading with other random stuff. I might have, Discworld, which I'm reading every month at the moment for a time. There are asterisks there that aren't important for the purposes of today's video, but in between the Discworld books, in between the Discworld and the Legacy trilogy that I'm reading currently as of, the months that this video is coming out, I have other stuff that I'm filling in the gaps in between to be different and to fill in space in my TBR in a different way. So I'm reading Rick Riordan at the same time that I'm reading Discworld and the Legacy trilogy. So these are three very different types of things. They could all be considered fantasy in one way or another, but they're very different, Discworld is more satirical and is very much doing a different thing than any other epic fantasy is doing. It's not even epic, really. It's a completely different thing. Legacy Trilogy is obviously epic fantasy, and then Rick Riordan is something entirely different. It's more of it's not even portal fantasy. It's just kind of a modern day contemporary sort of halfway fantasy thing that's going on based off of mythology. So it's like totally different vibes, making sure that I'm switching up that vibe rather constantly, consistently even, so that I'm never getting tired of anything. So like that's how I organize what I do, and that has worked. After 5 years since getting back into reading again, and 4.5 years of that time doing booktube regularly, I haven't had any burnouts or notable slumps. I mean, I've had like mini slumps, right? But I've experienced zero full complete slumps where I just have not been able to read or not even been interested in reading for a prolonged period of time. So I've had a couple of times where I've maybe gotten a little bit sick and that's affected my reading. I can remember in mid 2022, I got COVID and that definitely affected my reading for a few weeks. I've had times where I'm broadly more interested in some other things like gaming, and so I don't read as much. In fact, that was something that happened, in most of June, I think, was I wasn't doing a whole ton of reading because I was doing a little bit more gaming. I was still reading a good bit, but not quite as much, relatively speaking. So sometimes my interests are focused a little bit more elsewhere. And I also have periods of time where I'm simply, I've just had too much else going on in my life elsewhere for a while, and that can also sometimes affect the schedule. Nowadays, this year, sometimes work affects my personal reading because reading is part of my day job now, and so sometimes I just don't really feel like doing personal reading on a given day because I have too much work reading to do, and so I'd rather spend that time doing something that isn't that. So these things kind of affect me, but I've never had a full-blown reading slump where I've been completely at a loss for my desire or my ability to read for more than at most like a handful of days, basically. And that's been great. Like, I can't remember that ever being a thing when I was younger, because when I was younger, I was doing things from a completely different approach, not necessarily intentionally. It just was the way things were, and the way that I was doing it before wasn't working. What I do now clearly does work. So I've had 5 years of essentially zero extended slumps. I've only fully DNF'd one book in all of that time, and relatively very few books outside of that I've even really disliked. And finally, despite, like I said before, channel growth being slow as a result of my very broad coverage, I feel like I've developed a style and a quasi broad niche, quote unquote, that does fit my interests. That being not being penned into any particular corner, doing any one thing too much. And that's been really enjoyable for me. So for my personality, this is something that has really worked. As for the actual topic of today's video in the title anyway, why should you read a little bit more widely? What is in it for you to do perhaps a similar type of concept, to practice a similar type of reading pace on your own? Well, I think that there's going to be different benefits to different types of readers, and some readers do the whole back-to-back thing and never get burnt out, and fair enough. If that's what works for you, I'm not going to say anything to you. I can't guarantee that a similar strategy to mine is going to improve your life in any significant way. But that said, I can still make a little bit of a suggestion that doing this reading widely thing and reading rather diversely and switching things up in between even almost every single book, that can definitely help with certain problems. So I think that if you are somebody who slumps rather often, or if you slump for very lengthy periods of time, I think that reading widely, considering doing that, you can examine the possibility of doing this if lack of variety if is a potential factor. Like, is it because you're reading too much of the same thing and you're getting bored of that or whatever? If that's a factor, maybe you could consider just making sure that you read something different with semi-regularity to kind of break that kind of thing up, right? Do you often find yourself bored or annoyed by recurring tropes or ideas that are frequently within the types of books that you read? Well, you can choose to read something different that might not contain those kinds of things. For me, tropes are a little bit less irksome than I think they are for some other people, but maybe that's just because I'm not encountering them in everything I'm reading because I'm not reading the same thing all of the time. If that's something you're experiencing, is like seeing the same thing in every book you're reading, try something out of your wheelhouse and maybe that won't contain all of those same tropes. It might be an idea. Another question is, are you itching for something to just kind of push you into a different realm as a reader, maybe even to the next level, depending on how you think of these kinds of things? Even if that's not necessarily to a new challenge level per se, you can change and alter your overall perceptions of this hobby and of any given book you read by just giving yourself a little experience with something different. I'm not very versed with sci-fi, for example, but whenever I do read sci-fi, it definitely shifts and touches how I view other genres for sure. Even fantasy, even though sci-fi fantasy are more or less two sides of the same coin, just reading something that is a little bit different gives me more perspective on other things that I read. You're not seeing all the same things over and over. You're not overlooking little details because you're seeing different kinds of details in all the things you're reading. And it might just make you understand the medium a bit more as well. So there might be potential benefit in that. As a final question, have you simply just been curious about what else might be out there? If you're somebody who's just not super into reading a ton of different genres all of the time, you might just get a benefit from getting something new. You might find something that you've been missing for a very long time. There are plenty of people who just kind of avoid something because they've never really explicitly been into it, but once they get a taste of it, it's just like, wait a minute, why have I been ignoring this kind of thing my whole life? If you find yourself primarily or predominantly only reading one or two different genres the vast majority of the time, mixing in a little bit of other stuff can show you things that you might not otherwise experience, right? So if we're going to put things into a little bit of perspective here, three of my all-time favorite books of all time I have read this year. I mean, four, actually. I think I've read four books this year that have made it onto my official top 15 list. You can watch that video up in that corner as well. And all of those books are very, very different from each other. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami, Perfume by Patrick Zuskind, The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. These four books are all incredibly different from one another. You could scarcely even compare them to each other in any way that makes sense. Maybe Three Musketeers and Perfume, because they're both like more literary fiction than they are something else, but even that they're not super comparable because Alexandre Dumas is a very different type of quote unquote classic than something like Perfume is going to be in the future. You could consider it a modern classic. It's only like 40 years old or something, but in either case, I have four of my all-time favorite books that I've read this year, and they are in essentially no way, shape, or form really comparable to each other. And I think that I only really got to experience that this year because I've made such a point this year specifically of just reading a bunch of different stuff and not trying to read a bunch of the same stuff. I've been doing that since 2021, but this year in particular, I've been reading a lot more shorter books, that are very different from one another. And some of these books are things that like I never would have known about or would have tried without that specific intention of wanting to read different stuff. So, that's just a little bit of my experience, right? In general, I think that it is just always worth having some variety in your life, regardless of what part of your life that variety comes from, whether that be for, the fun things that you do, whether that be for giving yourself a little challenge, whether that just be simply for avoiding boredom or monotony, simply giving yourself a new experience every once in a while. There is benefit to having variety in your life. So what is it to you to read a little bit more widely if you're not somebody who does so already? There could be any number of different benefits, and I encourage you to ask yourself that question and to make a decision, and if you need recommendations, different ideas for where to go with some different topics, is just go explore, explore a little bit based off of the interests that you do have. There are ways to read certain books if you're interested in a particular type of thing already that might give you a new perspective, right? This is, a different kind of thing that I've considered doing for a while, is like making videos, like some lists about different books, like classics, for example, that you could read if you're into certain particular genres. I don't think I'm widely read enough, ironically enough, to even be able to make those kinds of recommendations broad scale, but there are certain things that are applicable. For example, if you're an epic fantasy reader, but you haven't read much literary fiction or any classics, basically, War and Peace is actually a really great entry point. It's a very long book, but if you've read epic fantasy, and especially if you've read a lot of epic fantasy, War and Peace is not doing anything that you're not going to recognize from epic fantasy with regards to a larger cast and a longer period of time that it takes place, different movements, so to speak, between different characters and the dynamics between them and how they change. An epic fantasy reader, I think, is very likely to enjoy War and Peace as a classic. And that's just one example of a ton, right? I think that The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell is a really good example as well, because, it's not a classic per se. It's also not even that old. It's only like 30 years old or something like that. Maybe a little bit more than that. I forget the year it came out, but it's not super old, but it's a book that I think would very much be considered a modern classic. I would call it a modern classic because of the, timeless way it explores certain religious ideas, and in an honest and earnest way that doesn't act as a gotcha or anything even remotely close to that, but also is a little bit sci-fi. So if you're into sci-fi or First Contact type stories, you can explore something a little bit different that also has that familiar type of, set dressing, right? So there's a lot of different ways to go, and, classics aren't the only one, of course. They're just an easy one to, point at, because classics isn't really a genre. Any number of things can fit within that moniker. Even literary fiction is scarcely its own genre. It can be just about anything. But the point I'm making is that there's a lot of things that you can try if you're not used to reading a little bit out of your wheelhouse. Just, it might take a little searching, and it might take a little trial and error. Not everything you read you're going to love, and there are going to be some things that you think you might like based off of what you like, but then you just end up not. But just, I would say, give it a shot, trying to read a little bit more widely if you don't already. And then be a bit patient with it as well. Don't expect everything to be a hit, but go into everything with an open mind. And maybe you'll find a new favorite book or a new favorite genre in some cases. And I think that would definitely be a bit worthwhile. So that's going to be the end of today's video. I hope that wasn't too much of a random, crazy, rambling mess. That I hope I managed to keep myself coherent throughout this video, because even just composing the notes for this was rough, and I did not keep to my notes very well. So I apologize for all of that, but with all of that being said, for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC. I hope you read a little bit more widely, and I also hope to see you in the next video.